what we need more than anything now from our landscape is carbon sequestration, flood risk reduction, biodiversity improvement, and all of those other so-called public goods. And those are just as important as any other product that can come from that landscape.
Welcome to another episode of Rewilding the World. I'm Ben Goldsmith, and I'm very lucky to be sitting with my friend Lee Schofield, Lee in the Lakes, author of Wild Fell, and architect of one of the most exciting nature restoration projects in all of Britain, in my opinion. Lee, where's your home exactly? Where are you talking to me from?
So I lived in a little hamlet up on the very edge of the Lake District National Park, a place called Berryer. We're sort of halfway between Penrith and Keswick.
So the Lake District is a place which is iconic not just for millions of British people, but all over the world. One of our most revered landscapes, made famous by Beatrix Potter and intricately connected with the formation of the National Trust. And most people would say that the Lake District is really an incredibly beautiful and naturally abundant and rich place. How would you respond to that if I knew nothing about the Lake District?
So I would say it's definitely beautiful. Beauty is very much in the eye of the beholder. And even when you develop an ecological understanding, when you start to inhabit Aldo Leopold's world of wounds, the landscape is still beautiful. You know, the underlying geology, the winding rivers, the deep glacial lakes, the soaring fells, all that, they're hugely dramatic. And it's very easy to understand why they inspired people like Wordsworth and Beatrix Potter. But as far as nature is concerned, it is well under par. The changes that have been wrought on the landscape of the Lake District are ones that have been evolving over the course of hundreds of years, thousands of years. You know, we've interacted with this landscape, with all of our landscapes in the UK over the course of thousands of years, and incrementally we've changed them and changed them and changed them again. And certainly in the case of the last 70 or so years after the Second World War, those changes haven't been very good for wildlife. And, you know, what we look at now, as far as nature is concerned, is really a shell of its former self.
Lee, can you give us a feel for where the Lake District sits and what its extent is?
So, yeah, the Lake District National Park is in the county of Cumbria, which is the northwesternmost county of England, so butts up against the Scottish border. And the national park takes up a good chunk of the county, so it's 2,362 kilometres squared. It's a big area. I think it's the largest of England's national parks, and it's a very, very popular place. It's visited by something like 20 million visitors every year. So, yeah, hugely revered.
I just read a book by Guy Shrubsole called The Lost Rainforests of Britain, and it seems to me that the Lake District is squarely in the temperate rainforest zone. Now, the 7 Celtic nations of Europe, which are, if I try and remember them, but they're Scotland, Wales, Ireland, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, Normandy, and Galicia, I think, are the places where the Celts retreated to, and are also the places that had, until not so long ago, significant amounts of a vanishingly rare habitat called Atlantic temperate rainforest. Is that right? Was the Lake District a rainforest place historically, and is there any rainforest left?
Absolutely, yeah, there is. I mean, I think denizens of the southwest of Wales may argue with me on this, but really I think the most important fragments of temperate rainforest are in the Lake District. So Borrowdale is probably the most famous of those, and that is a truly spectacular valley, you know, woodland, craggy oak woodland sort of rising up the hillsides, massive old veteran trees, the whole place sort of dripping with mosses and lichens. So yeah, we are absolutely squarely within that temperate rainforest zone. We have what is scientifically referred to as a hyper-oceanic climate, which basically just means it rains a bloody lot. And, you know, that is what keeps the place looking so green and verdant and allows these mosses and lichens to grow epiphytically on these big old trees alongside things like common polypody fern. And, you know, even trees growing in the canopy of other trees, where you get this sort of rudimentary soil forming with the remains of mosses. You know, there's often enough humus there for trees to actually seed into. And we've got some really amazing ones of those at Haweswater. So we're looking after a big block of woodland called Nadel Forest, which is not as big as Borrowdale, but still a very important site, designated a special area of conservation and a site of special scientific interest. And, within that woodland, we've got all of those features. We've got tree lungwort lichen. We've recently discovered hazel gloves fungus, the only location for it in the whole of northern England. And we've got trees that have got many other species growing up in their canopy. So it's a really magical place. And Guy's book is wonderful. And the front cover that he has that was drawn by the chap that did all the Lord of the Rings artwork just captures that sort of ethereal nature of the habitat. And it's tragic that we've got so little of it left.
Yeah, the definition of a rainforest is a forest that is wet enough that plants grow on other plants. And that's some of the plants that you've been naming. I don't think I've ever actually been into a true British rainforest. The fragments you describe are just that. They're fragments. What happened to the rainforest of the Lake District and when?
So most of the woodland clearances in the uplands of the UK happened a very long time ago. We're talking about the Neolithic period in most instances. So as we slowly converted from being, hunter-gathering people and taking on settled agriculture, we started opening up the landscape more and more and more for forage, for the livestock that we were starting to keep, but also for building and burning. And so we've had a largely open landscape for many centuries. The places where the woodlands have held on have been often sort of just chance, really. So the woodland that we have at Nadell Forest, that was preserved during the medieval period as a hunting forest. So the tree cover was valued for the cover that it gave to deer and wild boar and other animals that would have been sort of killed for sport and meat around that time. And that was just a long enough period to hold on to that tree cover. And it's gone through periods of being farmed. You walk through the rainforest at Nadell and there are old walls. You can see that it's been used by people for grazing, for charcoal production, for a whole range of different things. The ones that survived in Borrowdale, that was largely down to industry, charcoal production, but those are the exception. And in most places, the hill land was used for grazing. They were the wastes of the big estates, and they were given over to the peasants, basically, for grazing their animals. And so even though the trees were removed a very long time ago, it's those kind of more recent practices that have always prevented them from growing back. But we can see where they used to be. We can see their ghosts in the landscape, the ghosts of these woodlands, in the form of bracken beds. And bracken, I've been working a bit with Guy on sort of trying to get an estimate of how much bracken exists in the Lake District National Park. And his estimates, using all sorts of fancy kind of GIS tools, suggest that there's probably about 12% of the national park area which is just bracken. And bracken will only grow in the places that are suitable for trees to grow. It's a woodland glade species, effectively. So before those woodland clearances took place, the bracken would have been really quite rare. You would have got it in the glades here and there, and that was about it. But as we made those glades larger through that woodland clearance, the bracken was able to spread and spread and spread. And we kept it in check to a degree through sort of cultural practice, human practice, for harvesting it, for bedding, for thatching, for packaging, which kept it from spreading to a degree. But it was also kept in check by the presence of big animals in the landscape. So having cattle and ponies and pigs, they're all big enough, or their sort of activities are impactful enough to stop the bracken, to impact the rhizomes. But because those animals don't really exist in anything like the quantities that they did previously, and now most of the farms in the Lake District have just sheep on the hills, the bracken has been able to just spread almost to its maximum extent. And that maximum extent is probably telling you where the woodlands used to be. And I find it a really interesting sort of thought exercise to look at a bracken-dominated hill slope and superimpose trees and scrub back in there. And to my mind, it makes the place an awful lot more attractive, an awful lot more beautiful, and would certainly be a lot richer too.
Temperate rainforest is not the only ecosystem type that existed through the Lake District. You've obviously got the open bodies of water and the wetlands that surround them. You've got the rainforest, then you've got kind of wood pasture engineered by grazing animals, and we'll come on to the role of grazing animals in a bit. And then on the higher ground, presumably peatland, perhaps in the Lake District, and also alpine kind of flower meadows and areas above the tree line.
Yeah, and indeed habitats that we've pretty much lost completely. So montane scrub is a habitat that we're working towards trying to restore some of. And that's a habitat that has pretty well gone entirely from the whole of England. And this is a fantastically rich habitat that if you go walking in the mountains of Scandinavia or really any mountainous region in Europe, you will come across these sort of stunted, weather-beaten trees, often willows and juniper, sort of dwarfed versions of birch. And this is one of those habitats that occupies one of those sort of transitional zones that we often talk about in ecology as being really important. You know, it's often the edges between habitats that are really valuable. And the montane scrub is the habitat that exists above the sort of mature woodland that we all recognise, and then those windswept sort of dwarfed habitats that live on the very fell top. So those alpine meadows, the alpine heaths, and the blanket bogs. So I was really fortunate to go to Norway on a sabbatical a few years ago, and there's a couple of chapters about that in the book that I've written. And the montane scrub is just spectacular, and it has so many of the bird species that we find in other refugee habitats just doing really, really well. So you see ring ouzels, you see whinchats, you see black grouse, you see golden eagles hunting over the top of them, and all of those birds are birds that we think belong in bracken beds or on little cliff edges on burnt moorlands in the case of ring ouzels. And I think we've got it wrong. I think that all of these species are just living in places that are so substandard to what they really need that it's quite sad, really. So yeah, we need a lot more montane scrub. We need to work on those high altitude habitats.
This episode of Rewilding the World is very kindly brought to you by Uni, that's UNI, the world's first nature-friendly line of luxury body care. We've all heard about the harm that sun cream does to coral reefs, but it's not just sun cream and it's not just coral reefs. Well, Uni makes plastic-free, nature-friendly essentials like shampoo, conditioner, hand wash, and even natural deodorant, all full of nourishing ingredients such as seaweed kelp, aloe vera, and olive oil. We've been loving our Uni products, but don't take it from me. Here's my wife, Jemima.
Yes, I really love them. They're such clean and nourishing products. The microalgae body oil is so good and really smells amazing.
You can find Uni products at Space NK or at weareuni.com. The reason why so much has been lost in the British uplands is really about overgrazing. It's obviously trees cut by our ancestors, but mosaic habitats existed long after the original woodlands were cut, and that was on account of the continued grazing and browsing by domestic successors to the wild herbivores that were there before us. And then something dramatic changed at some point, a dramatic expansion in the number of sheep, and a reduction in the number of people and native cattle, as well as the loss of pigs and their wild cousins, the wild boar. Tell us a little bit about that social change that then led to kind of effective ecological collapse in our upland landscapes.
Yeah, so the big change really came after the Second World War. That concern that we had as a society that if another war were to break out, that food supply routes would be disrupted and that we might be left very vulnerable was justified. You know, we'd gone through this massive national trauma, the First and Second World War, and we wanted to feel secure, I suppose, and we wanted to feel secure in terms of the food that we could produce. So at the same time as this amazing new technological revolution was happening in terms of the production of fertilizers and other sort of agri-chemicals, the development of new big powerful tractors and quad bikes and steel frame buildings and nutritional inputs and veterinary medicines and all of this stuff just landing at the same time as government getting behind farmers to incentivize them to boost production. And it should be said that, you know, the farmers that responded did a spectacular job. You know, the yields just absolutely flew through the roof, particularly in the uplands. And, you know, these were our societal decisions. We were all complicit in this, or our ancestors were all complicit in this. This was what we wanted and we asked people to do. And we didn't realize at the time what the consequences for nature were going to be. So the biggest push came in the lowlands to start with, when, you know, thousands of miles of hedges were ripped out to make farming more efficient, and all of these technological advances were coming on board. And there was a concern that the uplands would be left behind. So upland-specific grants were brought in, and those included things like sort of moorland drainage, so trying to lower the water table across vast areas to try to convert boggy, sort of sphagnum moss-dominated habitats into something that had more grass in order to sustain more livestock. But the thing that made the biggest difference were the headage payments. So they were, for farmers, they were paid per head of livestock, and it's a lot quicker and easier to increase a sheep flock, because generally speaking, you'll probably have more of them to start with anyway, and each one will give you 1, 2, occasionally 3 lambs per year. And so farmers, being economically rational people, did what you would do if you were offered payments per head of livestock. They increased their numbers as quickly as they possibly could, and that led to a focus on sheep production over the other types of livestock that used to be kept traditionally, even though it wasn't very economic. And this is the real tragedy. You know, farmers have been asked to produce lots and lots of sheep and lamb from our hills, but they don't really make money. You know, the reason that we have lots of sheep in the uplands originally is because they gave us fleeces. It was the fleeces that paid the rent. The meat was a byproduct. Fleeces, tragically, no longer have any real value. You know, they're generally loss-making. It costs more to clip sheep than you get back for the sale of their fleeces. And we've been stuck with that system. You know, we've had this farming system that's been propped up by public money for the last 70 years, producing something that is becoming less and less demanded by the general public. And huge amount of ecological harm was done as a result of those policies.
Yeah, it's a huge tragedy, I think. 83% of the land we produce in this country is exported anyway. And sheep collectively account for about 1% of the total food production in terms of calories. So it's not working economically, and it's not working in terms of making a contribution to our food security. And the ecological impact of sheep, which aren't native to Britain, native to Asia Minor, has been catastrophic. Someone said to me recently that even if you look at the feet of sheep, that they're not suited to our wet landscapes. It's like going to a festival wearing stilettos. Large numbers of them die of exposure on our wet, windy hillsides. And a transition back to using native cattle in lower numbers surely is the key to not just ecological renewal in places like the Lake District, but also social and economic renewal for communities that are the soul and the backbone of our country. Is that transition controversial, and can it happen?
It's definitely controversial, but it also can definitely happen. But I think there is going to be collateral damage. You know, there are already farms in our area that are basically giving up because the funding arrangements are changing so much that they just can't really make it work any longer. So I think it's going to become a choice of kind of change or die for a lot of farmers, frankly. I think they're going to have to adapt to these new way of doing things. They're going to be forced to through the changing economic circumstances that are coming down the line through post-Brexit farming reform. And if they don't do that, then I don't think they've got a business model anymore. And so the thing that we need to do as a conservation community is help the farming community to make that transition. And we've just got a big project up and running funded by the Endangered Landscapes Programme called Cumbria Connect. And that's a major focus of that project, is trying to provide the business advice, the ecological advice, trying to help with the marketing of, you know, nature-friendly produce like wild venison, like beef, like perhaps rotationally grazed sheep. Because one thing we're finding actually is that sheep can play a really important role when they are in lower numbers and when they are managed in a very different way. People are very passionate about sheep farming up here, very, very passionate. And to come in and say, sheep have got to go, we're not going to get very far. This needs to be a journey for people, you know, finding ways that we can integrate sheep into these sort of nature-friendly practices is going to be absolutely essential if we're to have any chance of kind of bringing people with us here.
And the buzzword, of course, is numbers. You know, the number of sheep has inflated massively in the last 150 years, somewhere between 30 and 40 million sheep now in Britain. Certainly sheep have been around in this island for a long, long time, thousands of years. And the wonderful traditions of hefted herdwicks and, you know, flocks that know exactly which piece of land they're on and where to go. And that whole tradition has its beauty, of course, and has a really important cultural kind of place in our society. But it's a question of numbers, and it's a question of the vital ecological role that's played by native species such as cattle and pigs, which you talked about earlier. Lee, how did you end up in the lakes? What's your personal story, and how did you end up at Wild Haweswater?
So I was born in Scotland, but I grew up in Devon. But we moved up to Cumbria just before my son was born, because this is where my wife's from, and we wanted to be close to her family and all the benefits of living near grandparents and all that. And so, yeah, I've got a fairly typical career path, I suppose, for people that work in conservation, in that I did a degree in zoology. I then had to do lots of volunteering in order to gain the experience. Despite the salaries not being particularly competitive with other industries, working in conservation is very competitive. There are hordes of us who are desperate to contribute to the cause, the great cause of our time, which is tackling the climate and biodiversity crises. There is also something hugely rewarding about working outside, working with your hands, working with nature. So there are people queuing up to do the kind of job that I do. So yeah, you have to volunteer, you have to kind of like go through that rite of passage. And then I had a series of sort of short-term contracts with different wildlife trusts. And then this job at Haweswater came up, and I leapt at it because it was permanent. And I think I was quite naive to start with. I don't think I really realised the political sort of cultural frying pan that I was throwing myself into. And, it has been very challenging at times, working with neighbouring farmers who have a very different set of values about what they believe land is for, creates some real tension, and there are neighbouring estates who are absolutely on the same page as us, but there are others who have very different views. I was kind of criticised in the local paper by our Tory MP, Rory Stewart. And for somebody who just got into this because of a love of nature, all of a sudden I was thrown into this quite challenging, quite antagonistic environment from time to time. So I've had to grow a much thicker skin. Conservation is pretty political and occasionally quite aggressive.
One of the most provocative things that I'm able to say on social media platforms like Twitter is to talk about sheep. That you would not believe the passion and the fury in some of the responses that I get. Two names spring to mind. Rory Stewart's an interesting one, who's a former MP for Penrith, and is let's say no fan of rewilding. He's very much a believer in cultural landscapes, even if the culture that he's interested in preserving is quite a recent one, which is a lot of sheep stacked onto hillsides in the Lake District. And the other one is James Rebanks, the author of English Pastoral. James has gone through sort of voice of sheep farming in Britain, has gone through something of a Damascene conversion, as far as I can make out. He's gone from being a champion of sheep and sheep farming to being a much more nuanced champion of continued small-scale farming in our remoter landscapes with nature recovery. And he's done some amazing restoration of wetland and other habitats on his farm, and has become a passionate advocate for nature-friendly farming and for better support for farmers in the uplands as they seek to rebuild nature. And I think what's particularly interesting is the analysis James offers on why some of the damage has been done, why the big changes took place over the last 100 years. Do you have a relationship with James?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I mean, he lives a few miles away from me, and our kids went to the same primary school, so I know James pretty well. We talk quite a lot, and in terms of the things that he is doing on his farm, they're very similar in many ways to what we're doing. Big hedge corridors, lots of trees and wood pasture, re-meandering watercourses, hay meadows, rotational grazing, and move back to sort of more mixed farming, integrating cattle. And, I think he once described my book as almost like a photo negative of his. So he's a farmer that has sort of moved towards conservation and sees the value in restoring the health of the land. And I guess maybe I am a conservationist, perhaps a rewilder who has recognized that we need to be pragmatic, that we need to find compromises to bring people along with us, and that there is an awful lot of value to be had in farming, nature-friendly farming, and using farming to replicate our sort of wild natural processes. So, and just a comment on Rory Stewart. Rory's a really interesting character, I think, and a brilliant politician. Many values that I would agree with, but his view on land management and cultural heritage and rewilding, I think, is disappointingly short-sighted. And I think there's a number of historians or people who place sort of great store in cultural heritage and history that have this weirdly static view of it. There's this idea that somehow the farming that we've had for the last 70 years is the farming that we've had for the last 1,000 years. And it's just simply not true. Farming is constantly evolving and always has, as the demands of the customers, if you like, of society have changed. So when we were desperate for fleeces, when the satanic mills were in full force, we needed lots of sheep, we needed lots of fleece to feed that industry. What we need more than anything now from our landscape is carbon sequestration, flood risk reduction, biodiversity improvement, and all of those other so-called public goods. And those are just as important as any other product that can come from that landscape. And even though the actions might be different, the thought process that underpins those land management activities is exactly the same. We are making the land work for us. And, you could say, well, that's a bit of an anthropocentric view of things. But actually, if we don't look after the planet, then we're all screwed, right? So protecting the planet is protecting ourselves. And I think history, I just find it very baffling that people who seem so sort of passionate about history would want to try to keep things as they are. Because if nothing ever changed, how dull history would be. We're living through a hugely fascinating moment in time. And, I think we need to take that more dynamic view of cultural heritage and history and allow it to evolve in the way that we all desperately need it to.
And add to that the economic reality that upland sheep farming is not serving anyone. The average sheep farmer is taking home a net income of less than £7,000. And that's after quite lavish government subsidies historically under the Common Agriculture Policy. It simply doesn't work. So if we want these communities to thrive and prosper in the landscapes that they've farmed for generations, we really need to help them into a new way of farming, which revolves around multiple revenue streams from the production of food, less of it, but better quality, and also revenues from natural capital, nature tourism, and other things, even such things as putting high-speed broadband into these communities so that they can do a whole bunch of other stuff, which is what you find in places like the Cantabrian Mountains in northern Spain or the Apennine Mountains of central Italy. You find that families that have farmed there for generations do a whole bunch of stuff. They have a B&B, they do bird watching guides, they have some cattle, they do pony trekking. Maybe one of the kids is a graphic designer using the benefit of the high-speed broadband that's been installed. And I'm starting to put together a plan on which I'd really appreciate your help for bringing influencers in our upland landscapes to some of these European mountain ranges to see an alternative view where it's not just sheep farming. And your point about change is so well made. I mean, if you look at photographs of Kent in the south of England in the 1930s, it was all hops. I mean, there's very few hops grown in Kent today. It's endless change taking place all over the country. Lee, what exactly is Haweswater? How did that project come about?
So Haweswater is a reservoir. It's the most important reservoir in northwest England. It provides 2 million people with their drinking water every day. And it is owned along with the 10,000 hectare catchment around it by United Utilities, the water company. And the reason that RSPB are involved is thanks to golden eagles. So golden eagles were extinct in England for a long period of time, mostly sort of thanks to Victorian persecution. But in 1969, a pair reappeared in the Lake District. Their population at that time had been growing in southern Scotland, probably in part thanks to the plantation of new conifers. The massive dominance of coniferous forestry in the southern uplands is a really distinctive feature of that area now. And when conifer plantations are very young, they actually provide quite good hunting opportunities for birds like golden eagles. There's quite a lot of ground game and they can do very well. And their numbers built up. And then as those forestry plantations started to close up, they become, much less valuable to golden eagles and indeed most wildlife. And so that started to sort of force some of the golden eagles out into the wider area, and some of them went south. For a brief time, there were two pairs. There was one in the west of Cumbria, and then there was this pair that made their home at Haweswater. This was a pretty big moment in ornithological circles, and the RSPB sort of whirred into action and set up a sort of monitoring program just to try to keep an eye on these birds, keep the valley that they settled in, the Valley of Riggindale, to be as quiet as possible, to give them the best possible chance of breeding success. And so that established our sort of foothold in the area. And over the course of the next sort of 50 years or so, we've been sort of developing the relationship with United Utilities. We started doing bits of woodland management, bits of tree planting, and finally we took on the tenancy of 2 farms in 2011, which gave us the land holding that we now have. So we have a 45-year commercial tenancy with United Utilities, but it's also a partnership, and one that's predicated on managing the land in a way that benefits water quality and wildlife and people. So yeah, we're looking after about 3,000 hectares. So it's 2 enclosed farms and then some big chunks of common land. So it's just, a little over 1% of the Lake District National Park. So it's quite big when you're standing in the middle of it, but pretty small in the context of that whole national park area.
But these connectivity projects like yours can act as sort of ink blots that not only provide an exemplar of what can be done and therefore influence the whole landscape, but also can kind of expand outwards. Is that the goal? I mean, presumably your life's work is the restoration of the Lake District, not just that one project. What's the roadmap? How does that come about over the next 10 years, the transformation of an entire landscape?
So yeah, absolutely. I think an ink blot is a brilliant description. I've not heard that before. In a way, that's already starting to happen. It's really exciting. The Lowther estate, just to the north of us, who own a huge amount of land. They have about 50,000 hectares in Cumbria. They are moving in a very similar direction to us. They're starting to create huge areas of wood pasture. They've got a great herd of longhorn cattle. The sheep have gone. Fences are being removed. Trees are being planted. And that is influencing lots of other landowners in the area too. So partly they're being influenced by people like Jim Lowther, who's showing how that can work for estate finances as well as for nature. But people are also being influenced by this changing funding arrangement for land management. So, we're currently talking to people all the way down to Kendal. And, we're not beyond the realm of possibility of being able to stitch together a connected corridor of land that runs all the way from Penrith down to Kendal. And, the scope for species like golden eagle to return and make use of that, for black grouse perhaps to come back in, for salmon to make use of these sort of restored rivers with natural gravel beds again is absolutely massive. And I think we can't, what I've learned over the course of the last decade is that trying to force change on people is never going to work. We need to demonstrate, we need to show how this can be made to work for local economies, for livelihoods, for communities, as well as for nature, and do so in a way which is very open, and not suggest that ours is the model, but that it is a model. Every single farm across the country, and certainly the Lake District certainly included, is already delivering a degree of carbon sequestration, habitat improvement, water quality improvement, as well as livestock production. And I've started to think of it as almost like a mixing desk. You've got all these different sliders for these different outputs, and you can push them up into different arrangements. And some farmers will choose to keep their livestock slider up a little higher than we might do. But actually, we're all in the same game here, and we're just delivering a different range of outcomes. And I think that's the only way we're going to make progress. And it might be frustrating. It might not go as quickly as we might like it to, but it feels like we're going to get there, actually, at the Lake District at the moment. It feels like there is a huge growing tide of people recognizing that change is coming and engaging with it in a really exciting and positive way.
Yeah, I agree. It's a time of incredibly exciting change in our national park and other remote landscapes in Britain. Lee, can we just finish with an anecdote from you? Some wildlife experience that's given you great joy. Maybe the arrival of beavers in Haweswater recently, or some other moment that's given you particular and memorable joy in recent weeks or months.
Yeah, the beavers haven't arrived yet. Unfortunately, they are just down the valley in the Lowther estate in an enclosed area, and we very much hope that government will make a decision that will allow those fences to come down. And I'm confident that they will come up to us and colonise us when that happens. Water voles were reintroduced last month, which is very exciting, but it's somewhat less exciting than beavers, but we'll get there. But the biggest moment really for me in the time that I've been working at Haweswater was the return of the salmon to Swindale Beck. So we had a watercourse that was straightened, that was really sad, really denuded as a result of very rapid flows scouring away all of the gravel bed. And in 2016, we re-meandered it, worked with Environment Agency, Natural England and United Utilities to put the bends back in. And just astonishing how something as simple as making a river wiggly again just restored this incredibly diverse and dynamic habitat. And every time I go down to look at the beck, there are new pools and new riffles, and it's a living feature of the landscape again. And the crowning glory of that project was really that 3 months after the machines had left the site, having done that work, salmon were back. There was a salmon red just above one of these newly formed riffles. And, in that salmon red were thousands of fry waiting to be born. And the numbers of salmon have sort of grown each year. And to see a response like that from nature, just to see how desperate nature is to recover when we give her the opportunity to do, was something that will stay with me forever.
Oh, Lee, I love that so much. I watched the pictures and I re-wiggled our little stream, as you saw in Somerset. About a kilometre was re-wiggled, and life has just poured back into that bottom of that valley. And I think restoring streams and rivers to health by removing dams and weirs and just liberating rivers from their straitjackets and restoring the natural multi-braided meandering flow of the water through the landscape I think it's at the heart of landscape restoration. It's why beavers are so important. Water is life.
Absolutely.
Lee, what an absolute joy to speak to you. I could talk to you all day. It's just so exciting what you're doing up at Haweswater. And anyone listening to this ought to buy Wild Fell, Lee's book. It's just exquisite. And you ought to get on the train, get up to the Lake District, go and have a look at the project Lee's working on, soak in the landscape, and join the movement to restore Britain's national parks to the kind of vibrancy that certainly hasn't been seen for the last century, but kind of vibrancy that hasn't really been seen for centuries in some cases. Lee, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks, Ben. Lovely to talk to you.
For a lot of British people, the Lake District is just a completely iconic place, and a place that is actually quite disappointing when you get there. And so to hear about this extraordinary story of restoration led by Lee and other organisations really fills my heart with anticipation and joy. Really enjoyed that conversation. If you did as well, I'd be very grateful if you'd go into whatever platform you use to listen to these podcasts and leave us a review, like us, spread the word among your friends. It really does make a difference. Thank you. Next time, I'm going to be talking to Sanjay Gubby of the Holomati Foundation in Karnataka, southern India. Sanjay is working with the communities in which he grew up to piece back together corridors of vital habitat for all kinds of iconic Indian species, including rhinoceroses, leopards and tigers and so on. Sanjay is also leading efforts to build harmonious coexistence with such wildlife into the lives of these communities. It's an amazing story, and one that I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing about.
You already know that this isn't about one species. It's about systems, interdependence, collapse. And yet, wild salmon, one of the clearest indicators we have, are vanishing fast. Their decline signals something deeper, something more dangerous. I'm Jim Murray. I host The Last Salmon. It's not a side story. It's the biodiversity story that everyone like you should be listening to. Season 2's out now.
One of the best ways to support rewilding is to go and visit rewilding projects on the ground. My friends at the European Nature Trust have asked me to tell you about a series of coexistence adventures that they've put together. They're designed to give you the best chance of seeing Europe's most iconic species: bears, wolves, lynx, and so on. All of these are on the rise in Europe because of rewilding projects. These trips are hosted by expert guides and conservationists, and most importantly, the European Nature Trust is giving half of the revenues directly to the foundations working on the ground to restore wildlife. I'd love you to check out these coexistence adventures at the European Nature Trust website.